Takes on Instagram, Facebook, Raw Takes with Andrew Hoty, and on Twitter/X, you can find me at HotyAndrew. Welcome to Raw Takes. Like, comment, and subscribe below if you enjoyed this video. Please make sure to do that. Your feedback is always appreciated, and I want to hear your own Raw Takes as you listen to my Raw Takes. You may think things a little bit differently than I do, and I'm always open to hear that, and I'm always open to some debate. So make sure to please leave some comments below. Give me your thoughts on sports as I do every couple days here on YouTube. All right, let's get things started with those Cleveland Browns. They lose to the New Orleans Saints 35-14. Jameis Winston actually was pretty impressive. 395 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was 30 for 46, so a lot of missed passes, but no interceptions. I can't put this on Jameis Winston. I could put it on the lackluster defensive effort in the fourth quarter where the Saints just went on a ridiculous tear. I could put this on Dustin Hopkins, who has all of a sudden become the next Cade York. I mean, that's really where we're at with Dustin Hopkins after that kind of performance. Although if you actually look at historically what happens with the Browns in New Orleans in recent games, back in 2018, Zane Gonzalez missed a few kicks, and that cost the Browns a football game too. But having said that, you know, the kicker's the kicker. There was a lot of opportunities for the Browns to possibly bring that score even closer to 35-14 because Dustin Hopkins didn't make those kicks. So there's just problems galore with the Cleveland Browns. Having said that, though, is this all Kevin Stefanski's fault? Does Kevin Stefanski have to be the scapegoat here? I don't think so. The talk of Kevin Stefanski is he's just going to go somewhere else and be a great head coach. Someone else is going to hire him right off the rip. I believe that to be the case. So why would you get rid of him here? If everybody across the league wants to hire Kevin Stefanski, why would you fire that guy here? This isn't all the way his fault. How much can a coach put on a guy? Really? How much can a coach put on a team, let alone just one player? We obviously know the Deshaun Watson situation is a mess and has not panned out. We obviously know the Browns need a quarterback. We know there's so much talent on this roster that has essentially not been elevated because the team as a whole is just bad. It's just a bad team. But where does it all start? The top down. This is an organizational problem in Cleveland. Look at the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens playing a division title game, essentially. Not for the division title, but for the lead in the division on Sunday. Those are two stable organizations over the last 20-plus years that are getting it done time and time again. And what are the Browns doing? They're at the bottom of the barrel like they always have been. Last year was a glimmer of hope. Last year was wacko for Flacco. Last year was Deshaun Watson looked like he picked it up in the Baltimore game, but did we really see anything out of him with the contract he has? Probably not. Last year was a spark, though, and that starts from who leads the organization. Obviously, there's Jimmy and Dee Haslam, but then you go down and you see that Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski were responsible for the success we had last season. Absolutely responsible for it. We didn't end up winning a playoff game, but look at the injured reserve list. Look at the fact that Kevin Stefanski was part of a playoff winning team back in 2020. Look at the track record. The track record is more good than bad. Kevin Stefanski made Jacoby Brissett look like a really competent quarterback for a piece of 11 games, and that was without Joe Woods being fired yet. So, I think Kevin Stefanski has done more good than bad for the Browns. And how is a quarterback throwing 395 yards in a game in a loss where you only score 14 points? That's a problem. You only scored 14 points in that game. Clearly should have been more if the kicker could make a damn field goal or an extra point. But still, that's absolutely absurd that you lose 35-14 with a quarterback that threw 395 yards. Cincinnati's having a similar problem with Joe Burrow right now. But the Cleveland Browns are just an organizational mess. What this season should be an indictment on is not a coach, not a player, but a team and an organization. This is an organizational failure on the Browns' behalf. This is not a coaching failure. It's an organizational failure. Andrew Berry, if I were the Browns right now, Andrew Berry I think would be gone. I clearly think his draft picks are a liability. And if you were to draft a quarterback next year, which I still don't advise the Browns to do, believe it or not, and that may be some bow heads here for me, I don't think the Browns should draft another quarterback next year because of the Deshaun contract and maybe getting something out of Jameis Winston this year if the Browns don't win a lot of games. Having said that, Andrew Berry can't be the guy making these selections anymore. I think he might be a liability. He's good in free agency, but a draft guy, I don't see it. And we're about to have a first-round pick we're going to need that pick more than ever. And Jedrick Wills didn't pan out of some of Andrew Berry's first-round picks that he selected. Greg Newsome may be okay, but, not Jedrick Wills. So, having said that, I don't think Andrew Berry is the guy anymore. But Kevin Stefanski, on the other hand, I think could make up for this. I think the Browns could draft an offensive lineman or a wide receiver. Get Deshaun Watson back and healthy. Try him again. If it doesn't work, then we know he's not the guy. But you can't just get rid of him because of the cap hit. And you have Jameis Winston on this roster if you can keep him for cheap next year and just run the table once again with these offensive pieces. The defense clearly needs some adjustments now too, by the way, because what I saw on Sunday in the fourth quarter was garbage. And that's a Jim Schwartz defense. Jim Schwartz should be ashamed that that product was on the field in the fourth quarter because I didn't even recognize what the Browns defense was doing. It's not the Browns defense of 2023. Is it much more competent than maybe Baltimore or Cincinnati's defense? Absolutely. And they have a better coordinator with Jim Schwartz. But still, please, that was some crap on Sunday that we saw from the Browns defense. Myles Garrett might have had his worst career game as a Brown. That's how bad that game was. It was awful defensively. And I can't put the loss on Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston did what he could to try to win that game. Quarterbacks that throw 395 yards and 2 touchdown passes, it's not their fault. I'm sorry. It is not their fault. Jameis Winston did what he could to try to win that football game. And the Browns failed as an organization and as a team. It's going to be a lot of blame on a lot of different people. And I'm not trying to say Kevin Stefanski shouldn't be blameless. Obviously, there's coaching decisions that should be made better and worse. But with the track record Kevin Stefanski has here in Cleveland, and with people saying he's just going to get hired by another team, why get rid of that guy? Why get rid of that guy? And I get Mike Vrabel's in the organization. Did they bring in the consultant to be a replacement? Is it possible? Sure, it might be possible. Mike Vrabel probably could be a very good head coach for the Cleveland Browns. But I think the Browns are doing Kevin Stefanski dirty. I think they're doing the fan base dirty if they move off of Kevin Stefanski. It's an organizational failure for a season. But if the Browns decide to fire Kevin Stefanski, especially after this upcoming Pittsburgh Steelers game on Thursday, then they're doing the fans a disservice. They're doing the team a disservice. And everything about the Browns that we've come to know during the Kevin Stefanski, Andrew Berry era is a joke. It's an absolute joke. Because we had some great moments so far that could be repeated. You just got to run it back to a degree. You got to make some significant changes. As I said, Andrew Berry's someone I'd put on the chopping block. I'd probably put Ken Dorsey on the chopping block too. He's clearly the wrong offensive coordinator hire. I think the Browns regret firing Alex Van Pelt. I really do. They moved off the wrong offensive coordinator. Alex Van Pelt led a Deshaun Watson-led offense, essentially, to that Baltimore win last year, where he went 14 for 14. Now, I'm not saying Deshaun Watson's ever going to look like that again. I have my doubts about Deshaun Watson. But we're paying him too much money to not try to run this back. I really believe that. The only answer for the Browns financially is to run this all back. And if not, they decide to fire everybody. I think there's going to be all hell breaking loose with this football team, and we're going to see possibly quite a disaster that'll take place for another 10 years, and it'll be same old Browns all over again. This is the best coach you have since Marty Schottenheimer or Bill Belichick. But technically Marty Schottenheimer in terms of multiple winning seasons and playoff appearances. And you want to move off that. If you're the Browns and you want to move off that, go ahead and lose and lose and lose for the next 4 or 5 years. Because that's your choice. Last year was the principle to build upon, and so far it's been squandered, and it could be recovered just within a year. This is a league where you could get back to being a playoff contender within a year. Culturally, obviously, you need to make some changes, but some of these changes that were made this year turned out to be a disaster. You got to flip those changes back and get it going for next year, and I don't think head coach should be something that's on the table. Having said that, though, it looks possibly likely that Kevin Stefanski is going to be the scapegoat if this thing goes even more further south than it already has, because it's a mess in Cleveland. Let's look around the rest of the NFL, because obviously the Browns aren't going anywhere. Here's a team that's probably not going to go anywhere, and I blame coaching for this reason why. The Cincinnati Bengals losing that game to the LA Chargers, watching Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase playing the way they're playing, and the Cincinnati Bengals not performing to wins at all defensively. This is all coaching to me. I think the defense is obviously a problem. They're going to have to draft defensive next year if the Cincinnati Bengals end up not making the playoffs, which I don't think they will. And even if they do, I think they're a first round out easily. But the Cincinnati Bengals have defensive personnel issues. They have a head coach in Zach Taylor, who I don't really buy, and I don't know many people who do. Now, the Cincinnati Bengals as an organization are notoriously cheap, and they're notoriously known for letting coaches probably stay long after they're welcomed, like Marvin Lewis. And I thought Marvin Lewis actually is a terrific NFL head coach. He just didn't win playoff games, and that is a problem. But Marvin Lewis did change the culture in Cincinnati and led to where it is now to some degree. Zach Taylor got them to a Super Bowl, but what else has Zach Taylor really done that's been world-changing for the Cincinnati Bengals? So far, it seems like he holds them back more than maybe they should be at. I mean, they had Jake Browning last year, and I actually commended Zach Taylor because he got Jake Browning to keep them in the playoff race, and they were 9-8 by the end of the year, and they still didn't make the playoffs, but the Bengals were still in the mix the whole rest of the year with Jake Browning. So I actually commend Zach Taylor for that. But now we're in a position where T. Higgins likely doesn't come back to Cincinnati last year. Jamar Chase and still having some contract disputes from what we see. Obviously, Joe Burrow's getting paid all that money. It also comes back to the organization as a whole. The Cincinnati Bengals are known for being a historically cheap organization. We don't see Pittsburgh and Baltimore playing like that right now, hence why they're the two leading division teams right now. And that'll lead me to Pittsburgh and Baltimore. So Cincinnati underachieving, clearly. They should be a lot better than what they are with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase playing the way they are. It's criminal that the Cincinnati Bengals are not above 500 team. In all honesty, it's criminal. Going to Pittsburgh and Baltimore, though, those are the best cultures in this organization, by far. Mike Tomlin, longest tenured coach in the NFL. John Harbaugh, the second longest tenured coach in the NFL. And between them, I think it's only 2 or 3 losing seasons. I think 2. And I think that's John Harbaugh only who had those 2 losing seasons. Mike Tomlin never had a losing season. That's how good the Pittsburgh Steelers and Baltimore Ravens are. And they know what they're doing, clearly. I still think the Baltimore Ravens could be shaky at times because I think the way Lamar plays, he's injury prone. But having said that, he's been fully healthy and he's been the Lamar Jackson we've come to know in terms of the athlete and specimen that he is. Having said that, the Pittsburgh Steelers just scored only field goals and beat the Baltimore Ravens. They're in the Baltimore Ravens' head. And because of that, I think the Pittsburgh Steelers culturally are going to win this division because it's just too good right now. I mean, the Pittsburgh Steelers are well coached, exceptionally well coached. They play the game smart. They have a really good defense. And as much as I can't stand the Pittsburgh Steelers, you have to kind of commend them for that. Because they're just such a well-run organization with talent that's probably even more limited than the Cleveland Browns, Cincinnati Bengals, and Baltimore Ravens. I look at the Pittsburgh Steelers offense, and I'll be honest. I don't see the guys Baltimore has. I don't see the guys that Cincinnati has. Heck, I don't even see the guys that Cleveland has and probably should have in terms of Cleveland. Like Deshaun Watson should be a good quarterback. But, there's still David Njoku. There's still, Jerry Jeudy, who I think is really good. You have Nick Chubb running the football despite the injury. I think Pittsburgh's offense on paper should be a lot worse than Cleveland's, but it's not. And granted, that's on the Browns for being in that position, but it's not. And the Steeler offense is definitely worse than Baltimore and Cincinnati, so why are they leading this division? Because of culture. The culture has been established there long before Mike Tomlin. I mean, the Pittsburgh Steelers are the only organization, I think, in my lifetime that has never fired a coach. Or had a coach leave after retirement. Well, okay, they've had a coach leave after retirement, and Bill Cowher, but they have never had a coach essentially maybe be forced out like Bill Belichick kind of was. I mean, that kind of thing. There's not been many coaching changes in Pittsburgh that weren't because of a retirement. They've had 3 head coaches since 1969. The Pittsburgh Steelers are culturally one of the best organizations, probably in sports, let alone just the NFL, in sports. So, yeah, it makes absolute sense culturally why the Pittsburgh Steelers are in the position they're in. Having said that, though, I hope the Browns mop the floor with them on Thursday night, but I highly doubt they will. Going on to some of the other big games in the NFL, Dallas is just a mess. If we talk about that Monday night game for a second, The Cowboys are a wreck. There's just nothing good about them right now. Obviously, injuries taking place, but even when Dak was fully healthy, the talent's not being maximized. I thought the Cowboys, when they played the Browns earlier this year, were absolutely on fire and probably a Super Bowl contending team. But granted, I thought the Browns were a likely playoff threat as well at the beginning of the season, and the Browns have proven to be nothing but bad. So the Dallas Cowboys are just probably slightly better than them. They're in New York Giant territory bad. Their only 3 wins this year are against the Browns, the Giants, and somehow, some way they beat the Pittsburgh Steelers. Probably shouldn't have. The Dallas Cowboys are just not in a good position right now. Obviously, Mike McCarthy has to go. I said at the beginning of the season, I don't think Mike McCarthy would deserve to go because I thought the Cowboys would be a playoff team. They're not on the road to being a playoff team. So I think the Dallas Cowboys absolutely fire Mike McCarthy this year, and I think it is time for him to go, and I think they start looking for a new head coach. I'll throw a name out there. I think Doug Peterson would be a good hire, even though I think Jacksonville should fire him just because he's very familiar with the NFC East. But having said that, based on his track record in Jacksonville, it's probably going to be really hard for a guy like him to get a job. Kevin Stefanski, if he gets fired from the Browns, I think that's another possible name the Dallas Cowboys look at because Kevin Stefanski's kind of an under-the-radar guy who doesn't say a lot in press conferences. Jerry needs to have that spotlight in Dallas. That's definitely something I think the Cowboys might look at if Kevin Stefanski and Doug Peterson end up being available. I think for sure Doug Peterson will be. Kevin Stefanski, I'm not so sure. I hope not, for Cleveland Browns' sake, Kevin Stefanski doesn't get fired. Having said that, though, the likelihood of that looks much and much more increased. The Houston Texans, though, they have just stepped up to the plate and proven they're the better team in Houston. And I don't want to make this about the Dallas Cowboys because I just talked about the Dallas Cowboys being a dumpster fire because that's what they are right now. The Houston Texans are far from that. They kind of got smacked around in that Detroit Lion game a little bit, and they played well in it, getting 5 interceptions on Jared Goff, who's playing some of the best quarterback in the NFL we've seen this season. However, look at C.J. Stroud, how phenomenal he's been. And the guy rarely turns the ball over, let's just be honest. He did last night, but he rarely does. He makes smart decisions, and as a Buckeye, everybody in Ohio is rooting for C.J. Stroud. It's just been so fun to watch what the Houston Texans have kind of been able to piece together, and to watch them and absolutely annihilate the Cowboys the way they did was special. And the Houston Texans should have no problem winning this division. I thought because of their 2 back-to-back losses, especially the loss to the Jets, there was a possibility they could be on the verge of a little bit of a collapse. But because of the rest of this division, Indianapolis looks like the only real threat to them. So I would say the Houston Texans should have no problem sealing the deal and getting back to the playoffs. Who they may play in the playoffs might be a bigger question than not, because I'm not so sure C.J. Stroud is ready to compete with the Josh Allens and the Patrick Mahomes of the world. I think he's better off facing maybe a Lamar Jackson again and getting kind of revenge on the Ravens. And I still believe they have to play each other later this season. We haven't seen the Ravens-Texans rematch of the playoff game last year. The LA Chargers might be a great matchup for them, but the Chargers' defense is ferocious. Are we sure that C.J. Stroud's ready to play that kind of defense? Possibly, because he torched the Browns' defense last year. And the Chargers' defense this year kind of reminds me of that. So it's possible. But the Houston Texans right now are definitely above and beyond anything I think anyone could have expected with them 2 years ago. Obviously, they made all the right draft selections, and they could thank the Cleveland Browns for that in some aspects. A lot of aspects. But you know what? It's a really good football team to watch. I enjoy watching the Houston Texans. I was stunned the way they blew that game to the Detroit Lions. But as I said before, the Detroit Lions are really good. And the Houston Texans are really good too, but I don't think they're Detroit Lions good yet. But because the Houston Texans essentially had that game on the ropes the entire time and let Detroit back into that game, that's where I get concerned about a team like Houston. But other than that, they have all the weapons. They have a great quarterback, and they have a defense that's starting to kind of rise to the occasion, especially yesterday. Dallas made it a game until about the third quarter, and then it got out of hand, and C.J. Stroud essentially just took them by storm. It was not even close by the end, and it was 34-10. So that's props to the Texans, an organization that a lot of people were essentially ridiculing to no end, and rightfully so. They were very bad for 2 straight years, but D'Amico Ryans comes in there, changes that culture right away, and I even said right off the rip, once they hired D'Amico Ryans, that's a guy who's young, energetic, and fun. I would want to play for a guy like that, and I think that's exactly the way the Houston Texans feel. Having said that, though, I still think this is a 4th-seeded team, maybe a 3rd-seeded team. I think they're a little bit better than the Pittsburgh Steelers. But I would say this team is definitely going to host a playoff game, and it might be tricky depending on the matchup because I don't think this team is ready to compete with the Josh Allens and the Patrick Mahomes when it comes to the playoffs. Having said that, though, C.J. Stroud did beat Josh Allen earlier this year, but I am really excited to see the Houston Texans play the Kansas City Chiefs in a few weeks because I like the Houston Texans to stun the Chiefs in that game. Going now to Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes, the Bills finally putting the Chiefs' reign of terror to rest, winning 30-21. I still think that's bad they won that game. I think they should have lost to the Chiefs, and here's why. I'm glad the Chiefs lose, too. I'm not someone who is rooting for the Chiefs year after year. I'm kind of sick of them, like everybody else. Maybe not kind of. I'm very sick of them. But I think when you look at the Buffalo Bills' track record of constantly beating them in the regular season, but never in the postseason, that could come back to bite you. And we see a lot of times in the playoffs, teams come back to bite you again. Like, look at the Browns last year. They destroyed the Texans. Obviously, no C.J. Stroud, but they destroyed them no problem in the regular season, only to get bit in the butt by the time the postseason came along. And that's what I think the Buffalo Bills have had a constant problem of. They'll take care of the Kansas City Chiefs in the regular season. Then they'll get home field advantage against them, and what will happen? The Buffalo Bills will just stumble and fall on themselves. And like I said last year, Kansas City didn't just win the Super Bowl. The road to the Super Bowl was helped by Buffalo, Baltimore, and San Francisco. All three of those teams had opportunities to beat the Chiefs and didn't. All three of them did. They just tightened up and blew it. All three of those teams had opportunities to put them down, and they didn't. So it's on those three teams for the reason the Kansas City Chiefs won back-to-back Super Bowls. The Miami Dolphins were the only team the Kansas City Chiefs didn't have a game get blown against because they absolutely annihilated the Dolphins. Having said that, though, the other three teams blew those games. With that being said, the Kansas City Chiefs are still the favorites to win this whole damn thing. The Detroit Lions, I think, are the most confident and the team unlikely to make the most mistakes against the Kansas City Chiefs. The Detroit Lions should have no mistakes against them, in my view. I just think the Detroit Lions play very mistake-free football. But it can be a little bit of a risk. So I think the Kansas City Chiefs are the clear favorites. I'd put the Detroit Lions second. Buffalo probably third. But Buffalo has to break through and show they could beat them in the postseason. Beating them in the regular season, sure, it's fun for all of us Kansas City Chiefs haters. Sure, it's fun for Josh Allen to watch his highlight reel that he had on Sunday, and it was a really good highlight reel. Having said that, though, I want to see the Buffalo Bills break through in the postseason and finally put the Chiefs to bed, because we haven't seen it yet. And the Kansas City Chiefs torch them time after time again. I would have lost that game if I was Buffalo and just focused on the postseason. I really would have. Because I think looking at the Buffalo Bills schedule, they should have no problem getting back to the postseason. All right. I get you want to win every game, and I get that's probably the wrong attitude to have, but I just look at NFL history, and I look at teams that go back to play in the postseason, what happens to them. And the Kansas City Chiefs have a history of pretty much biting you in the butt. Moving on to the Detroit Lions and the NFC leading team over there. The Detroit Lions are probably the best team in football outside of Kansas City. I only put Kansas City ahead of them because of their track record. But let's just highlight the scorigami here. 52-6. Scorigami, scorigami, scorigami. That's the first time it's ever happened, and I love it. I absolutely love it. 52-6. That is their second scorigami blowout win. They blew out the Dallas Cowboys 47-9. They're destroying the bad teams, and they're coming back and beating the good ones. Hence the Houston Texans game last week. I mean, they essentially torched the Minnesota Vikings at the end of that game they played with them. The Detroit Lions are blowing out the superior competition to a degree. Okay, the Detroit Lions aren't necessarily... The Detroit Lions are blowing out a lot of the competition that is weaker, and they're coming back on the teams that are really good, like the Houston Texans, like the Minnesota Vikings. I mean, they're winning those games close, but they're still winning them. And Jared Goff, outside of the Houston Texan game and maybe the first couple games of the regular season, has been playing mistake-free football. The only loss the Detroit Lions have this year is to Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who I still think have a chance to make a possible postseason run. Maybe not postseason run, but a run to the postseason. I think the Buccaneers are in prime position to do that looking at their division because they're so injury prone and Baker Mayfield's really not the reason they're losing football games. He's been one of their better players. Having said that, you look at the Detroit Lions right now and just how complete of a team they are, and that they're just destroying everybody. And they have Chicago coming up. Do you think they're going to just lose to the Chicago Bears? Maybe they do because division games are weird, but I think that they're going to absolutely mop the floor with them in at least one of those games. And they play them on Thanksgiving too. So far, the Detroit Lions' Thanksgiving reputation hasn't really been recovered yet because they still lost to the Green Bay Packers on Thanksgiving last year. So they got to kind of clean that up a little bit too, and I'm sure they're motivated to do so. But the Detroit Lions are in prime position to really start to run the table here and get back to the postseason and make a really good push to get back to the NFC Championship and hopefully the Super Bowl. That team is just fun to watch. They have an answer almost at every position offensively. You look at wide receiver, you have Amon-Ra St. Brown as your number one, essentially, and he's really good. Look at tight end. Sam Laporta has put himself into the top 5 conversation. Offensive line, top-notch. No Aiden Hutchinson. They now have Zadarius Smith, but the defense is still all-world, and they've shut down teams. The Detroit Lions of last year didn't shut down teams the way this Detroit Lion defense is. They destroyed the Cowboys, and they destroyed the Jacksonville Jaguars. And they did it in games that weren't even close. And those are weaker opponents, so props to Detroit for taking care of business. But come on. In the NFL, when you're destroying opponents like that while coming back on really good teams like the Houston Texans in a game where your quarterback throws 5 interceptions, yeah, that's the best team in football outside of Kansas City. Believe me. And they lead the NFC. Who's the biggest threat to the Detroit Lions right now? I don't know. San Francisco is clearly not as strong as they were in years past. Los Angeles Rams are kind of coming back into the mix, and that rivalry's kind of gotten fun because of the Stafford-Goff situation. But I don't really buy the Rams making some sort of mystical postseason run. And I'm going to get to the NFC West in a minute because that division's interesting. Philadelphia maybe, but I'm not really sold on the Eagles. There's still some issues defensively that I don't buy yet. And I want to see them finish out this season strong before I start to buy into that. And I still think the Detroit Lions can give the Philadelphia Eagles hell. The Washington Commanders are still too young, even though I think the Washington Commanders are a threat to the Eagles. And the NFC South teams, I don't buy at all. Tampa Bay, they're the only team that did beat the Detroit Lions this year. That was kind of a revenge game for them. And if the Tampa Bay Buccaneers end up winning the NFC South, I don't see that happening. I just don't. I think the Detroit Lions absolutely annihilate them. So the Detroit Lions are in a position right now where honestly it's theirs to lose. And they do play San Francisco later this year, and San Francisco is in that division race, but the Niners are very flawed this year compared to how they've been in the last 2 years. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the NFC West briefly. 6-4 the Arizona Cardinals, 5-5, 5-5, 5-5. That's the Rams, Seahawks, and 49er record. Yeah. And remember at the beginning of the year I said there's one team I'd watch because of Marvin Harrison Jr. It was the Arizona Cardinals. Although Marvin Harrison Jr. hasn't really been the XX factor for them, I think Kyler Murray has just proven to be a little bit better than given credit for. Having said that, I still think he's an average QB at best, but the Arizona Cardinals have put themselves into the playoff race, and they could possibly do some damage down the stretch and maybe win this division. I still think, honestly, Seattle is a little bit better than them on paper. I think the 49ers and Rams on paper are better than them too. That division is going to be a horse race. And you look at the wild card race too. NFC North, you already have Green Bay. You already have Minnesota. They're already in really prime position to make wild card berths. You look at the NFC South. I think, honestly, that's going to come down to a division winner. But looking at all 4 of those teams right now, outside of Carolina, really 3 are going to be probably contending for that division. And even New Orleans I'd throw in there just because I think they had that 7-game losing streak, but their offense really picked it up against the Cleveland Browns in the fourth quarter, and Derek Carr is healthy again, and their schedule, I think, is favorable in some aspects to them. Tampa Bay, I think when everybody gets healthy, they'll be more of a threat, but they lost 2 games to the Atlanta Falcons, but the Falcons just got destroyed by the Denver Broncos. So I'm not really so sold on the Atlanta Falcons either. And then you look at the East, obviously, the Cowboys and Giants are done, but Washington and Philly are going to be competing for the top spot there. The NFC North, I think it's essentially just going to run through Detroit, but Minnesota and Green Bay are probably 2 wild card teams. So really, it's going to come down to the wire in the NFC playoff race. I think your only solid playoff teams right now are Detroit, Philadelphia, and Washington. I think everything else is a wild card. Because honestly, it's hard to tell out of all the teams remaining in the NFC which ones are going to break through and make a playoff berth. Now let's go back to the AFC, and I think there's a team we need to start keeping an eye on, and that is the Denver Broncos, who I just mentioned beat the Atlanta Falcons. They're now 6-5. I kept saying it's going to be a collapse at some point. There's going to be a collapse. Well, they're 6-5 right now. If you look at their schedule, they still have to play Cleveland and Cincinnati, Are those games necessarily in Cleveland and Cincinnati's favor at this point? Probably not. The Denver Broncos are 6-5, and they have some pretty impressive blowout wins over the Saints in particular, and of course this week against the Falcons. They also blew out the Buccaneers earlier this year. They're exceptionally coached under Sean Payton, and no one's really talking about them. And they almost beat Kansas City last week. So, yeah, the Denver Broncos, I think, need to start getting into the conversation as probably a playoff team. Having said that, long-term wise, I'm not so sure the Denver Broncos are going to be a consistent contender just because they've been so inconsistent and weird since the Super Bowl year. There's been nothing really consistent about them since 2015. And so historically, I'd like to say right now the Denver Broncos are just on a path of being a really weird football team, and they still kind of feel like a really weird football team. But having said that, they're 6-5, and they are the 7th seed in the playoffs right now if the season were to end. So, yeah, the Denver Broncos could be a good playoff team. They could be a playoff team. I don't know about a good playoff team. I think that team still would lose easily to a Baltimore or Pittsburgh or a Kansas City or Buffalo or anything like that, or Houston even. But they're playing well, and we're not really talking about them much. And I think it's coming to a point where we have to look at Bo Nix as stepping up too and getting in that conversation with Jaden Daniels as one of the better quarterbacks from this draft class. We obviously haven't seen that from Caleb Williams. And obviously now the Bears look like they could have made 2 mistakes. Could have had Bo Nix 2 now at this point. Could have had Justin Fields, Bo Nix. You could have had as well Jaden Daniels, and you got Caleb Williams. So that's obviously an indictment on the Bears as an organization. But yeah, the Bo Nix situation is getting a little interesting now. And the Denver Broncos are going to slowly start to possibly find their way to the playoff discussion. And I think we're going to keep their eyes on them. I think a lot of eyes have been off them. And now that we're seeing them blow out wins against the Saints in prime time, against Atlanta, it's probably time to start talking about the Denver Broncos being a pretty good football team. So yeah, keeping an eye on them is going to be important too. All right, the Cleveland Cavaliers are taking on the Boston Celtics tonight in the NBA In-Season Cup, which I've highlighted already. I can't stand it. I think the In-Season Cup is a dumb idea. It's just really stupid. I don't like it, and I hate all the courts with it. I really do. Especially Indiana's a second year in a row. Last year it was like Indy and all blue, and now it's, I think what it is something Ride Baby Ride or something. I don't know. I think it's something to do with the mascot, which seems kind of clever, but I don't think you should make a whole court out of it. But never mind about the in-season tournament cup courts. Let's talk about the Cleveland Browns and the Boston Celtics, the magnitude of this game. Who is going to be running the Eastern Conference essentially may come down to this game. If the Cleveland Cavaliers win it, I think they're running the Eastern Conference. The Boston Celtics win it, I think they break through a little bit. And over the course of a few games, I think we'll see the Cavs start to come down to earth a little bit, and the Boston Celtics essentially pick up the pace and bury the Cavs to about their level with 3 losses. So it's only 1 loss, of course, though. If the Cavs lose tonight, they're in prime position to make the playoffs either way. The Boston Celtics aren't fully loaded yet, obviously, with Porzingis, that situation. The Cavs even really aren't because we've had Merrill day-to-day. Donovan Mitchell's coming off rest. Maybe you wanted to protect him against the Hornets because you knew you were going to need him for the Celtics game. I still think it's dumb to rest your stars like that in a game like that, especially with the fans paying money and all that load management, yada, yada, yada. I know the NBA is trying to combat it. It is what it is. The Cavs got to win this game and bury the Celtics a little bit more and try to hold on to this lead in the Eastern Conference. The offense is good enough to do so. The Celtics are shorthanded right now. Porzingis obviously not being in is going to be a big thing, I think, against the Celtics. So, yeah, the Cleveland Cavaliers, I think, should easily win this game with no Porzingis. But having said that, I'm not going to be surprised if they lose. It's been a fun streak either way. We play Boston in a little bit back in Cleveland, so we could probably take the game here at home, and that will make me feel good too. But let's keep extending this streak as long as we can. I really like what the Cleveland Cavaliers are made of. I like what Kenny Atkinson's doing, and this has really been a wild run for the Cavs. So it's really important the Cavs get this done. All the stars are healthy tonight and playing. Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, Jared Allen, and Darius Garland last I checked. They all should be good to go for tonight. And those core 4 guys are going to be for the land, as we're saying here in Cleveland now. But we got to let them know. The Cavs got to drain this game, get to 16-0, and start to slowly and surely prove that they are the threat and the deal in the Eastern Conference. And already with Golden State being in the position they are in, although Oklahoma City, I believe, already overtook them in the West, I still think Golden State's got some vulnerabilities, but the way they started the year, the Golden State Warriors